Hello there, this is Alucard or Adrian Tepes, and this is another episode of Castlevania Lore. Today's Castlevania Lore, we'll be talking about 10 most brutal plot twists in Castlevania. Castlevania games don't exactly have a plot, right? Well, in a long series of games, there have been various degrees of revelation within the progress of the software and hardware through which the games were developed and published under. Here in this video, we will be talking about the most brutal plot twists throughout the Castlevania game series in its long run, even including the Lords of Shadow reboot or alternate universe. This series is a long-running series from its origins with the original Castlevania being released way back in 1986, with Simon Belmont setting out to destroy Count Dracula with his whip known as the Vampire Killer. All the way up to the NES and Game Boy titles through obscure PCs made by game console companies, into the third dimension with Nintendo 64 and PlayStation 2, and followed by the Nintendo DS titles and the Lords of Shadow alternate universe which followed. This episode will be covering 10 plot twists along the long game franchise's run and honorable mentions, so get ready, get seated, and enjoy the show. And now, number 10 is Belmont's Revenge. The first big plot twist is on the second Castlevania game released on the Nintendo Game Boy. At number 10, this is a revelation that another member of the same Belmont clan is with the enemy, or at least until you knock some sense into him. In Castlevania Belmont's Revenge, Christopher Belmont, the protagonist of Castlevania the Adventure, discovers in the sequel to the original that not only is Dracula returned within his lifetime, but his son is also an ally of Dracula, at least for now. This moment on the Game Boy was the first time that Belmont became an antagonist and a boss battle to the player character. This wouldn't be the last time that Belmont was an antagonist, but not by a long shot, but it sure played with the concept of an evil twin the way Zelda 2 The Adventure of Link played around with Dark Link, or the original Prince of Persia played around with the Dark Prince, or part of the Prince's soul. Either way, after Christopher Belmont finds out that his son Soleil has gone off rogue, he fights a Belmont versus Belmont boss battle, after which his wayward son is set right again, and Christopher continues his progression to stop Dracula a second time. That's sure pretty frequent for Dracula supposedly comes back to life once per century. Well, to be fair, the Dracula would not return again for 100 years, which would be the time of the original Castlevania with Simon Belmont. And that leads into our next big twist, speaking of Simon Belmont. And now with number 9, we have Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest. In Castlevania 2 Simon's Quest, you had a significantly different type of gameplay than the original Castlevania. Simon's Quest involved traveling along the countryside of Romania and fighting monsters throughout the vast world. Unlike the original Castlevania, which focused on Dracula's castle and progression within Dracula's castle alone. You could also go and buy items from merchants, which combined with a more open world exploration in the game would be a mechanic used frequently in later Castlevania games after these two mechanics were used here. The main plot reveal, however, is that Dracula had cursed Simon Belmont, the protagonist of the first Castlevania game, with a curse that would cause Simon to grow ill and die over time. Simon refused to accept that it was his time to die, so he headed off to bring Dracula back to kill him off again and end Dracula's curse. This is the first time in a Castle game where you had Dracula's curse or the Curse of Darkness, which would be featured at least once more in Castlevania games to follow. And even have a Castlevania game named after it. Wow. Either way, similar to Christopher Lee's portrayal of Dracula, this is also a demonstration of how it was very hard to be sure that you were rid of Dracula for good. Coming in at number 8 is Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. While the poor-selling NES game, Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse did begin a new trend in Castlevania games. What kind of new trend, you may ask? It introduces characters other than your typical Belmont whip wielder as your playable characters. While you start the game playing as Trevor Belmont, the ancestor of Simon Belmont living in the 15th century, you can unlock other companions whom you can play as, each with their own story in both the manual for the game or from walls of text on the screen. Playable companions which you can take with you on your journey to destroy Dracula include Sypha Balnades, the witch, or as I like to call her, the assassin nun, who casts fireballs or ice spells at the enemy. Grant Dynasty, the noble who became a bandit similar to Robin Hood, or Alucard, the son of Dracula, who looks way different from Symphony of the Night. This was due to a retcon in which Alucard was born a human and made vampiric by his father, Count Dracula. They retconned that origin for Castlevania Symphony of the Night and made him a Dhampir or half vampire. Each of these optional companions was unlocked by a boss battle, either with the characters, such as Alucard appearing to be Dracula with his bat transformation and fireballs being launched, or freeing the character from a monstrous transformation like Grant or Sypha. Either way, expanding the gameplay from the wielding Belmont into other characters was a big first for Castlevania at the time of release, which would have been seen more in the later games to come, along with individual stories which the optional companions gave to you in walls of text, which is understandable given the technical limitations on the NES and Famicom back in 1989. Alucard would also be featured in multiple games after Castlevania 3 as a supporting or even as a playable character. Another big first in Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse was the appearance of the Doppelganger, the demon which imitates the player in boss battles. In this case, the Doppelganger impersonates whichever character the player is controlling at the time, whether Trevor or any of his three companions. The Doppelganger would appear once more. This would not be the last time you would meet the Doppelganger in a Castlevania game. It would appear a number of times in other titles. And now, we're going to number 7. And number 7 is Castlevania Rondo of Blood. While originally released for an obscure console known as the PC Engine, or known in North America as the TurboGrafx 16, Rondo of Blood had more to it than just being another Belmont tale. In the game, Dracula reveals that his power to return to life is linked to the evil of humanity on Earth. As humanity becomes more wicked, the gulf between Dracula and Hell or Chaos and us in the material world becomes thinner, and it becomes easier for Dracula to come back to life. This is a more concrete concept or explanation than just the idea that he comes back every century, and it certainly explains in retrospect how sometimes, as in the case of Simon's Quest, Belmont's Revenge, and others which would follow, Dracula doesn't necessarily need 100 years to return. He could return due to a great war, massive economic crisis, or other horrible situations brought about by the wickedness of humanity. This would repeat as a theme in later installments, and in this case, Dracula is brought back by a ritual. And we'll later find out that Dracula had a similar return in a later game in terms of release, but in, say, well, most games, except for the gulf of time in between Belmont's Revenge for the Game Boy and the original Castlevania with Simon Belmont. That was 100 years. But other times, it wasn't exactly 100 years because there was some kind of evil ritual or some kind of evil of humanity on Earth that brought Dracula back. So, there we go. And now we're going to be going on to number 6. And now, number 6 is Castlevania Symphony of the Night. There's a number of elements in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, which while they were at first for most of those who started the franchise with that game, Symphony of the Night, which is for quite a few people, those elements were not a first, but a return to using mechanics such as merchants and keys to unlock new areas from previous games such as Simon's Quest or Vampire Killer. The game had a number of retcons in the nature of the canonical protagonist, Alucard, or Adrian Tepes, the son of Dracula. No longer a human-turned vampire, Symphony of the Night retconned Alucard into a half-vampire or Dhampir, similar to Blade from Marvel Comics or Vampire Hunter D from the manga and novels written by Hideyuki Kikuchi. And his design was somewhat inspired by Vampire Hunter D in terms of his new black outfit. Well, he didn't have a hat like Vampire Hunter D does, but... And don't worry, I like those other Dhampirs too, and there'll be videos about them later. Also was a first, or rather wasn't a first, was a rogue Belmont, which in the case of Symphony of the Night was Richter Belmont, having become corrupted and now a boss battle. In this case, Alucard returns the favor to the Belmonts by canonically, yes, there are multiple endings here, canonically he brought Richter back from his demonic possession. So, after that boss battle, you bring Richter back, but it's not a necessity the way it was in Belmont's Revenge on the Game Boy. there's another big revelation, and that is how far Castlevania Symphony of the Night goes into emphasizing to you that the castle of Count Dracula, Castlevania, or Demon Castle Dracula, Akamado Dracula, is a living creature with malevolent intent. It is alive and evil. It's always been hinted that Castlevania or Akamado Dracula is an evil entity, but in Castlevania Symphony of the Night, there's multiple situations going on here which strongly imply it and strongly drive it to you that this thing is alive. Now, the original title in Japanese is Akamado Dracula, or Demon Castle Dracula. So the title, going back to the original Castlevania, before it was changed for the American release, yes, it's a living creature. But in Symphony of the Night, there are elements such as the fact that this castle literally projects hallucinations of Alucard's former companions or the doppelganger, and that really puts the implication here that this thing is alive, and it is mentally working against Alucard or whatever, or whomever is intruding inside that castle. And literally, you have a boss battle in which the castle is casting monsters at you, and those monsters are made to take the form of Trevor Belmont, Grant Dynasty, and Sypha Belnades, and you fight all three of them in the Colosseum in the inverted castle, which is interesting because this two different castles thing is somewhat of a concept you see in, say, Legend of Zelda with the Dark World and Light World in A Link to the Past. Here in Castlevania, this concept would not be the last time, but you have two versions of Castlevania, or Dracula's castle. There's the dark version, or inverted castle, that's in hell itself, and there is the version of the castle of Count Dracula in our material world. So you go in between these two different castles to fully complete the game. In the worst ending, you don't make it into the inverted castle, but in this canonical ending where you play through and you win the boss battle with Richter without killing him, there you go into the inverted castle, and you go in between these two different castles to solve for the ending of the game and meet the end boss, which is Dracula, but he is hidden in hell. So when it comes to a living castle, parts of the castle, especially the inverted castle, are alive in terms of game mechanics, where they can be drained of life as a renewable source of healing, such as the stone skulls which rise and fall like pistons, and dangerous traps to obstruct your progress. If you were to play around with the Soul Steal spell or the life-draining Mournblade weapon, many parts of the castle are in-game mechanics treated as alive. You literally take soul energy from candles, various traps, and it heals you as if you were draining life from a living creature. Many of these Metroidvania games that would follow would have multiple castles or dungeons you would go inside. And it would follow after this example given by, or this Metroidvania, which Koji Igarashi attributed to Legend of Zelda and the dungeons you would go inside. But this big revelation and this how blatant that you're shown this castle is alive and evil is one of the biggest parts of Symphony of the Night. The other part is showing the chaotic realm or hell, where you go into the inverted castle and you're in this alternate dimension. This castle is warped, there's tons more monsters in this inverted castle, and that is where you find Dracula himself in another dimension from our world, the chaotic realm or hell. This is where Dracula goes when he's dead, and then he returns from this alternate dimension of pure evil to come, and you see the swirling energy in the Dracula boss battle, and you see the true incomprehensible immaterial nature of this evil dark dimension. So there we have it. There was a number of things that kicked off the Metroidvania set of Castlevania games with Castlevania Symphony of the Night. Now we're going to go on to number 5, which is going to be more along the lines of how the plot progressed. So hang on, we're going on to number 5. Number 5 is Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. The last official Castlevania game released in 2008 on the Nintendo DS, Castlevania Order of Ecclesia covers the story of the Order founded in the wake of the Belmonts being rendered temporarily out of business following Richter becoming unworthy in the events of Symphony of the Night. This game occurs somewhere in the first half of the 19th century. Barlow, the leader of the Order of Ecclesia, and his adopted children, Albus and Shinoa, are devoted to fighting evil threats as villains for the Belmonts, or so it seems. The new Order of Ecclesia is researching how to combat the power of Dracula through mysterious mystical glyphs. A triad of glyphs, supposedly meant to combat the essence of Dracula's power, were known as Dominus. Shinoa was chosen as a vessel for the power of Dominus, but the ritual to infuse the power of Dominus was sorely interrupted. Albus interrupted the ritual and stole the Dominus glyphs, nearly killing Shinoa and leaving her unconscious. After Shinoa awakened, she found herself not remembering much of her life, also feeling quite emotionally dull. Over the course of the story, Shinoa found out that the scheme of the power of Dominus was not originally what it was supposedly meant to be. The scheme was shown to be a sacrifice of whomever had the power of Dominus to bring Dracula back to life. This is not the first case of Dracula's cult followers seeking to revive the Dark Lord. However, it's far different, because unlike Shaft, who is just a character that they introduced to you, Barlow was someone whom the player Shinoa knew. In fact, Barlow adopted Shinoa and Albus and raised them as his children. He taught them in the ways of what appeared to be the light. This hypocrisy makes quite a bit of difference in the order of this game. It's worse. This isn't some priest who decided to worship the Dark Lord Dracula or worship the devil himself. This is someone who you knew. He put on an act. And hence, hypocrite being a word for actor, this man put on an act of being a man seeking to fight evil when he was actually serving it the entire time. It makes the revelation far more brutal in the Order of Ecclesia. Whether intentionally or not, Castlevania and Nocturne attempted to pull a similar relationship between their version of Maria Bernard and her father, the priest known as Abbot. But talking about the difference between the Requiem collection and the Netflix streaming adaptations is for another episode. By the way, having a nemesis and agent of Dracula as close to you as your father was a big upgrade for the character known as Shaft in the Requiem collection, as this wasn't some clergyman deciding that opposing evil was overrated, but this was your own father who decided to betray you and sacrifice you for Dracula's return. Now, there'll be something a little bit worse than this regarding your father, or at least your adopted father, but for now we're going to go a little out of canon. We're out of the Iga canon, generally out of Castlevania canon as we know it, with the next one for number 4. Number 4 is Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Now, this is the one time I'm going to go out of canon to the Lords of Shadow universe, so calm down. Don't lose your horses. I know a lot of you don't like what's out of canon, and some of you think that Lords of Shadow is derivative of Legacy of Kain. I'm just going to be honest here and say the Legacy of Kain series is a superior story to what you get in Lords of Shadow, but I found it interesting in what they explored with Lords of Shadow to an extent. But this does not make number 1. If you disagree, you can talk about it in the comments. Now, going into Lords of Shadow, here's the main premise. What if Castlevania had a different origin story? What if Castlevania had different characters? With Konami as the publisher and the Spanish developer Mercury Stream, Lords of Shadow explored a different imagining of Castlevania in the non-canon Lords of Shadow games. Covered in 3 games, the saga of Lords of Shadow had a new Belmont family, with its progenitor, Gabriel Belmont, being the first subject of the Lords of Shadow. Released on the Sony PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 consoles in October of 2010. Gabriel, following the mysterious death of his wife Marie, goes on a quest to destroy the Lords of Shadow, corrupted former nobles whose wicked remnant was left on Earth after their good souls ascended into heaven. Gabriel was accompanied by his mysterious paladin brother Zobek in his quest to destroy the Lords of Shadow and the curse which the Lords of Shadow had brought upon the Earth, which would apparently destroy the world if it were not cleansed. In the conclusion of the original Lords of Shadow, Gabriel finds out the plot behind the Lords of Shadow and the author of that plot, none other than Lucifer or Satan himself. Lucifer, the angel banished from heaven into the dark pits of hell, had conspired with Zobek, who was also revealed to have secretly been the alternate form of the Grim Reaper, or Death, in the Lords of Shadow universe. This would not be the only time in a game entitled Castlevania where the Grim Reaper, or Death, would use the letter Z in his alias. It also wasn't chronologically by release the first time that happened. Keep that in mind. Not only had Zobek been secretly the Grim Reaper, but he had accompanied Gabriel because this was the origin story of Dracula. So think of it this way. The reason why Zobek was your companion this whole time was because, guess what? The Grim Reaper is the companion of Dracula, and the Grim Reaper was your companion here. The first Belmont had also become the Count Dracula of the Lords of Shadow universe. This would be the equivalent of you playing a Star Wars video game as Anakin Skywalker, without a foreknowledge of Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. Which, given how Star Wars movies had revealed the fact since The Empire Strikes Back, it was nigh impossible for most people to not know that outcome in Star Wars. But in Lords of Shadow, it was well done, revealed bit by bit, as Gabriel killed the Lords of Shadow one by one, and they tried to let Gabriel know that he was a monster too, to no avail. The other revelation in Lords of Shadow was that Gabriel had been the author of the very same tragedies that had inspired him to embark on his quest. He had secretly put on a demonic mask. With this cursed mask, he came under the demonic influence and possession of Zobek, secretly a Lord of Shadow himself. And under that possession, Zobek had ordered Gabriel to kill his own wife Marie by his own hand, to which Gabriel, being possessed, had complied. This act and this revelation remain a guidance and a haunting to Gabriel in his life as Dracula, the Lord of all vampires, following Marie's death in the Lords of Shadow universe. Now, in Mirror of Fate and Lords of Shadow 2, there were additional revelations such as the first of Gabriel's equivalent Belmont foes as Count Dracula was his unknown and long-lost son, Trevor, digging deeper into the idea of Luke and Anakin from Star Wars. Gabriel would also discover a plot to dethrone and destroy the devil himself as well. But the Lords of Shadow stands out as a new origin story in the reboot and alternate universe of Castlevania, in which the hero came face to face with a tragic self-fulfilling prophecy to become the villain and become haunted by forevermore the ghosts of those he once knew. Alright, now Castlevania plot twist number 3 is Castlevania Lament of Innocence. Now originally, the origin of Castlevania and the Belmont-Dracula feud was that of Castlevania Legends, with the implication that the Belmont bloodline was continued by the offspring of Sonia Belmont and Dracula's son, Alucard, or Adrian Tepes. This concept was discontinued and the game removed from canon in 2000, along with other games such as the Castlevania 64 games. There are a number of issues with this plot twist addressed by Iga as being that in his vision, the Belmont lineage should not have been started as a union of the Dracula and Belmont bloodlines, along with Iga feeling that Alucard did not officially rebel against his father until Castlevania 3, 1476, in which he would join Trevor's party after a boss battle, which is funny because that's similar to how the other companions of Trevor join you. You have a boss battle with them and then they decide, hey, we'll be your friends now. So it was a big thing that Iga decided, hey, it starts with Castlevania 3. Also, it would change is Dracula's origin. Originally, Dracula was Vlad the Impaler. Or rather, Vlad the Impaler was retconned into an identity or an alias that the Castlevania version of Dracula himself assumed when he came to Wallachia and became their monarch. And so, Koji Igarashi's vision of how the Castlevania story began was manifest through Lament of Innocence. Lament of Innocence begins with two French knights, Leon Belmont and Matthias Cronquist, who had fought for a time in the Crusades. Leon came home early when he learned that his fiancée Sarah had been mysteriously kidnapped. He would then perform the first castle raid of the Belmont clan against a vampire lord. Not against Dracula, but against another vampire named Walter Bernhard. Leon receives an alchemical whip from a slave of Walter Bernhard known as Ronaldo Gandolfi, and Leon upgrades the whip into what would eventually become the vampire killer of the Belmont clan over the course of the game. Leon is ultimately unable to save Sarah as she had already been bitten by Walter Bernhard, and so he Mercy kills Sarah as she is turning vampiric, making the vampire killer whip its namesake. You'll hardly ever get to see a friend named Matthias in person, even though the opening narration mentioned him. I wonder why that is. Out of a few things Lament of Innocence did accomplish, it did give a voice to vampire characters other than Dracula back in late 2003, such as Joachim Armster, a vampire slave of Walter held captive behind the waterfall in the game. Joachim proved an interesting boss to battle with his set of telekinetically controlled swords which he used to attack you. He does appear similar to Hector, the main protagonist in a later Castlevania 3D game known as Curse of Darkness. This leads to fan theories that somehow Joachim reincarnated as Hector. Before we get too distracted, let's get back to that fellow knight named Matthias, who was mentioned in the opening narration. Yes, Matthias shows up at the end to congratulate you for killing Walter, but then he reveals the gut-wrenching truth. Matthias had been behind Walter Bernhard, kidnapping Sarah. He had orchestrated just to get to Walter Bernhard, and get Walter Bernhard killed so that he could usurp his power, and become an even more powerful vampire lord. Such an underhanded betrayal, along with how Dracula became the powerful lord of vampires himself and inspired the Belmonts as his arch-enemies, makes Lament of Innocence among the greatest plot twists in a Castlevania game. And so the game ends with Leon vowing that he will commit himself to destroying Matthias and the monster he has become. The game ends with the Grim Reaper as the final boss battle at a cover of Matthias, now Dracula, as he retreats into the night. So yeah, you're wondering why this Origin one wasn't number 1, but don't worry. These other ones, which I will pick as number 2 and number 1, and the honorable mentions should be pretty good. You can discuss the order you think it should be in the comments below. Without much further ado, we're going to go to number 2, followed by the honorable mentions. And now, number 2 for these plot twists is Castlevania 64. Count Dracula has certainly been one to utilize manipulation in the Castlevania franchise, as we saw from Lament of Innocence before this. And as we saw, he led his best friend into a confrontation which got his fiancée killed and gave him the seemingly endless immortality of a lord of vampires. Perhaps an even worse trick he performed was that of using the form associated with innocence against his enemies. When did he do that? Well, that's why we're talking about Castlevania 64, isn't it? Let me show you. Now, in the game of Castlevania for the Nintendo 64, it's no longer canon, but it was the first step as a game into exploring Castlevania played as 3D games. Fighting the game as the Belmont heir known as Reinhard Schneider, the great-grandson of Richter Belmont carrying the vampire killer, or Carrie Fernandez, who was originally intended to be Carrie Belnades, but like Sypha Belnades before her, Carrie is a spellcaster using ice and fire magic. Progressing through a labyrinth of mechanical traps, monsters, and potential fatal fall from great heights, you progress through Count Dracula's castle in the year of 1852 with some interesting apparent anachronisms such as skeletons on motorcycles. What are the skeletons on motorcycles doing here? Don't ask me, but the game was intended to occur at a later time in history as the early stages of development. But they left those skeleton critters on motorcycles in there. And it's funny at times. That and Frankenstein's monster with the chainsaw. But the one really great thing about these games when it comes to Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, which I'll touch on in a later video reviewing these games, is that in these games they really translated a lot of the mechanics we had in the 2D Castlevania games into a 3D game. A little bit less was involved in Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness, as you will find out when it comes to these mechanics that you had in the 2D games, such as the traps, such as the monsters, and so on. But Castlevania 64, as the first 3D Castlevania, really carried over a lot of these mechanics into a Castlevania game, so I'm going to note that. But getting back on topic, and we're not going to go on a tangent this time, among all these monsters and death traps on the way to battling Dracula in his throne room, you made an 8-year-old boy named Malice. The boy seems innocent, but it's odd how in a castle full of monsters and death machines, he isn't killed. Like, how's he still alive? How's he okay? Does he have, like, plot armor thicker than a tank to still be alive? Oh, and don't worry, this revelation is worse. It's worse than anything mentioned by that animated Grim Reaper. Sorry, Death. You need to understand more lore. So let Alucard have a turn to explaining what's really messed up. In fact, in Castlevania 64, the boy named Malice has the full consciousness of Dracula. He is Dracula. That whole child body is a disguise to fool you and get you destroyed. It's that underhanded. It's that much of a knife in the dark that Count Dracula is literally pretending to be a child and prey upon your instincts to not hurt a child. And how you see a children as innocent, he's willing to prey on that. So, the horrible story is that Dracula's soul had reincarnated inside the boy when he was just a fetus. So this boy named Malice was always Dracula, even before he was born. And he had the mental capacity, he had the full consciousness of an adult Count Dracula in there. And he's manipulating you, getting you to think that he's just a boy. He is the Count himself. Now, how do you beat this disguise? So if you're familiar with your Latin, you would realize naming the boy's name, the meaning is evil. Malice is evil in Latin. But how do you make sure not to get fooled by this disguise? Well, this game runs on a timer. If you take too many days using the Sun and Moon cards, you will get the bad ending where you only fight what appears to be Count Dracula, but is not. This revelation here is that no, this Count you see in the early part of Castlevania 64 is not actually Dracula. He's actually a French knight named Gilles de Rais who was hanged for being a serial killer, and his charges were the murders of over 100 children. They found dead children in his basement. That's how sick this guy is. But that's who the Count you're seeing here is. Count Dracula had his servant, Gilles de Rais, whom is revived and brought back as a vampire, to impersonate him and fool you into thinking that you'd won. He'd gotten you to go through this conventional rounds of thinking, okay, I go into Dracula's castle and kill him, when you didn't get Dracula. And as much as this game is not canon anymore, or became decanonized, that plot twist and Dracula being this manipulative to get you to think that, oh, I went through the regular routine of fighting Dracula in the throne room. No, you didn't. That wasn't Dracula in the throne room. That was another vampire pretending to be Dracula. And that's just a big trick. It's really good for a trick, and it's really good for the first Castlevania 3D game to have that plot twist in it. In addition to it being a good translation compared to other 3D Castlevania games, and being as old as it was, converting 2D to 3D. So what happens if the bad ending? Well, here's what happens. Reinhardt takes Dracula in disguise home. He takes Malice home thinking, I'll take care of the boy. But the boy will presumably kill Reinhardt, and he's limited the blood monsters of bloodline against him. If Carrie, he gets her to make a bad oath that she will marry him when they both get older. Yeah, it's creepy. And in that sense, that revelation, even though that ending isn't the official ending or the good ending of this game, is pretty well done. It's pretty well done for a plot where you think, okay, I'm just going to go into Dracula's castle and get him. That Dracula tricked you into thinking something was Dracula, thinking somebody was Dracula when he wasn't. And, you know, as an honorable mention, I'm just going to say there was Legacy of Darkness, the prequel story, with a werewolf named Cornell, and he gets Cornell out of his own desperation to go and give up his werewolf essence to curse Dracula and bring Dracula back to life. So these plot twists are, in my opinion, pretty underrated. And you don't have to agree with me that this is number 2, but it was pretty good. For the first 3D Castlevania game, they really didn't pull their punches and put some interesting plot twists in this game. So, I have to say, I hope these Castlevania Nintendo 64 games get a remaster so we can play it on PC. Or today's consoles, whether it's the Switch, Xbox, PlayStation, or all the above. They're pretty good. And they were liked somewhat on release. I'm just saying that now, it's been so long, we could use the experience of playing these games as hard as it is, and it would be worthwhile. Alright. honorable mentions. So before we move on to the final number 1 mention in this episode, I feel it's time to talk about the other honorable mentions in the Castlevania franchise. They had awesome plot twists, but they just didn't make my top 10. If you feel they, in your opinion, make your top 10, feel free to comment about it. So, while they didn't make number 1, they are nonetheless noteworthy and deserving of being up there in the rankings of the most insane plot twists in the Castlevania game series. So, I'm going to get started. Let's talk about these honorable mentions. They're good, even if they didn't make the top 10. Now, the first honorable mention is Castlevania Bloodlines. Castlevania Bloodlines was the lowest selling Castlevania game so far. It was released on the Sega Genesis in 1984. Due to what is likely a combination of poor timing as newer consoles were nearing release in 1994, combined with the game being released on the Sega Genesis and most of the 1990s games released on Nintendo consoles, and possibly poor advertising, Castlevania Bloodlines sold a mere 40,000 copies on release. Thankfully, the story started Bloodlines spawned a sequel and a conclusion in the Nintendo DS title Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, released later in 2006. What Castlevania Bloodlines did elaborate on was the wickedness of humanity draws Dracula back to our world, mentioned by Dracula in Rondo of Blood, and offers payoff to that idea. In Castlevania Bloodlines, the niece of Count Dracula and cousin of Alucard, Elizabeth Bartley, or Elizabeth Bathory, secretly manipulates the rulers of European nations into starting World War I. Manipulating the political landscape from behind the scenes, she managed to get public opinion and politicians convinced into settling their disputes with the bloody conflict that was the First World War. This calls back to Dracula's taunt in Rondo of Blood and Symphony of the Night that so long as humanity embraces violence and greed, it invites him back to their world to rule over them as an avatar of humanity's worst excesses and sinful nature. All the violence and greed involved in World War I served as a catalyst for Dracula's loyal niece and worthy heir summoning him back once more in 1917, in spite of 1917 being only 20 years from Dracula's return in 1897 with the events of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel. And 1897 in the Dracula novel is considered canonical to the Castlevania timelines, with some maybes and maybe nots, because there's details in the novel. Bloodlines also confirm that in spite of the real-life Hungarian Countess being the inspiration behind the literary character of Carmilla in the novel, that Carmilla in Castlevania and the infamous Hungarian Countess Elizabeth in Castlevania are separate characters. Bloodlines is also a reference to the family lineages of Dracula and the Belmonts, respectively. Dracula's lineage was represented by both his niece Elizabeth as well as one of the playable characters named Alucard, whose family had inherited a spear from Alucard and carried on the tradition of Dracula in battling dark forces. Alucard was presumed dead and succeeded by the Cards at this time in Bloodlines, which is retconned by both Symphony of the Night, showing him being alive in 1797, along with the Sorrow games revealing him to also be alive in the 21st century. So with the continuity and what we know so far, we may not know why Alucard was not present in Castlevania Bloodlines or its sequel. There are some interesting aspects to the Alucard clan. Alucard is the reverse of the Romanian phrase of Idrak El, or he is the devil, symbolically naming Alucard as being in opposition to Dracula the way Alucard is signified as being in opposition to Dracula by having the reverse Dracula name. Like the Belmonts, Eric Alucard also lost his first love to a mercy killing after she was becoming vampiric due to a bite from Elizabeth Bartley, leading to Eric vowing that he would never allow that awful night creature's. The Belmonts were temporarily out of the game, and so John Morris, not to be confused with his son, Jonathan Morris, filled in for the Belmont role. John being the son of Quincy Morris from the novel of Bram Stoker's Dracula. Richter had given the vampire killer to the Morris family sometime after the events of Symphony of the Night in 1797, making the Morris family the new prime hunters of Dracula in the Belmont stead. And so with the Morrises, the Alucards, and Dracula, the bloodlines of Belmonts and Dracula represented in Bloodlines, hence the title. But this would not be the end of John and Eric traveling all over Europe and vanquishing Elizabeth and Dracula in 1917. There would still be another generation in this story in World War II. The next honorable mention in these Castlevania plot twists is Castlevania Portrait of Ruin. In spite of Bloodlines being a poor seller in the Castlevania franchise, the game did receive a sequel and a closure to the story it set out to tell with Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, released 12 years later in 2006. Castlevania Portrait of Ruin closes off the story of the other families standing in for the lineages of Dracula and the Belmonts, with another adventure from John Morris and Eric Alucard's children years later in 1944. Dracula's castle mysteriously returns in 1944 in the midst of World War II and in keeping with the Great Wars bringing forth wickedness that summons Dracula back from the underworld. John Morris had died by that time and Eric Alucard was missing, leaving John Morris's son Jonathan and his friend Charlotte Allen, a spellcaster with a similar style to Self-Bound Ladies or Carrie Fernandez, to pick up where John left off. Jonathan and Charlotte explore the returned castle of Count Dracula, only to discover that it's not Count Dracula but another vampire named Bronner and his apparent twin vampire daughters in the haunted castle, with the Grim Reaper all the more upset that he can't seem to find the boss in this castle. Jonathan and Charlotte weren't all alone against this new enemy, however. They found a friend in a mysterious ghost calling himself Wind, and had a priest named Vincent Doran who helped supply them in their expedition. While Symphony of the Night had two different versions of the same castle, Portrait of Ruin also had worlds within the enchanted paintings made by Bronner, which added to a number of mini-worlds in ancient Egypt or a European city to explore, taking the concept of different maps to explore even further than Symphony of the Night did with the worlds within the enchanted paintings. Bronner himself was based on real-life artist Victor Bronner, including some of the real-life painter's artwork being shown in the background of the game, especially in the Vampire Bronner's boss battle. The castle of Count Dracula is also shown to an extent to be a living entity as it was in Symphony of the Night, with the castle being shown to be normally linked to Dracula as a symbiotic relationship. The symbiosis between the castle and Count Dracula was ultimately demonstrated with the defeat of Bronner as a boss, in which it turns out you've been subjected to a bait and switch with the plot, and Count Dracula was still going to become the end boss, but with Bronner's defeat, the castle rejoined to Dracula himself, leading to the last act of the game where Dracula shows he was still the ultimate master of his demon castle. Even more, the story of Bloodlines would come to a conclusion. The ghost you had met earlier, calling himself Wind, was revealed to be none other than companion of Jonathan's father, John Morris, in Castlevania Bloodlines, the real Eric Alucard. Eric had been killed by Bronner and become a ghost within Dracula's castle, although thankfully he became a good ghost who helped the heroes instead of the many malevolent spirits within the castle. In addition to Bronner trying to usurp Count Dracula's castle, Bronner had also taken Eric Alucard's twin daughters, Stella and Loretta, in an attempt to replace his own lost daughters who had died years ago. In the good and perceivably official ending of Portrait of Ruin, Eric's daughters Stella and Loretta are cured of vampirism, leaving them once again as human, and Eric's ghost leaves for the afterlife, having finished his business with aiding Jonathan Morris and Charlotte Allen in stopping Dracula at the time. Portrait of Ruin wraps up the story of the Morris and Alucard families fighting Dracula. With Eric dead and his daughters human once more, the Alucards are presumably no longer in a place of being the heirs of Dracula's son and fighting Dracula. In a tribute to Eric Alucard, the official artwork of Eric Alucard for Portrait of Ruin shows a sad and mourning Alucard in the background. Of all people, you do not see Alucard in person in Portrait of Ruin, but he of all people is featured in the portrait of Eric Alucard as his predecessor, and one from whom the Alucards inherited their calling to battle against the forces of darkness. It's never really confirmed if the Alucards are Alucard and by extension Dracula's bloodline by direct descent, but regardless they were his heir by designation. Numerous fan theories have come about trying to explain how the Alucards came to be, but there has been to this day no official confirmation of their origin. They did represent Alucard or Adrian in Tepes when he was not available for unexplained reasons. The Morris family was done standing in for the Belmonts after 1944. At some point after Portrait of Ruin, the Belmont descendants received the vampire killer back, with Julius resuming the tradition of the vampire hunter clan in 1999, and Alucard was there with him at that event which was mentioned, but you'll never get to play in the 1999 battle between Julius and Dracula, unless this is in the game of Vampire Survivors or one of a number of game mods made by fans over the years. But Portrait of Ruin was the end of the stand-ins by the Morris and Alucard families, before the Belmont heir known as Julius and Alucard, along with Yoko Belnades, all came back to claim their rightful roles from centuries past. Alright, so here's another honorable mention The another honorable mention is the Sorrow games. And while yes, we were robbed of getting to see the Demon Castle War of 1999, we do get to see what happened in the aftermath 30 years later. Dracula's dead, but his castle mysteriously shows up in Japan more than 30 years later in 2034 for the events of Aria of Sorrow. A young man named Soma Cruz visits the castle and has shown over the course of the Sorrow games that Soma has the ability to gain and use powers of his slain enemies, an aspect of the power of Dominus, and that the entity known as Chaos has chosen him to become what Dracula once was, as the avatar of Chaos or the devil on Earth. Soma canonically chooses not to and fights off other powerful potential successors to the title of the Dark Lord over the course of the 2 Sorrow games. But Dawn of Sorrow, the second game, offers a rather hopeful conclusion that while there will always be a Dark Lord, it didn't have to be Soma specifically. He could be free of becoming a Dark Lord altogether. Now, this was not the first concept of an idea of Dracula becoming reincarnated, as that had happened in the case of Malice in Castlevania 64. And I mentioned Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness in this one regardless of official canon, but the difference between Malice and Soma was that Soma didn't have a chance of not fully becoming what Dracula was, and Malice did not. Malice was always Dracula even when he was born, and even as a child, Malice inevitably became the monster, making it all the more horrifying in the case of Malice that he was literally adult Dracula running around in the body of a child. Now, my dear audience, you don't have to agree with me leaving out the plot twist of the Sorrow games and its more hopeful twist, but it becomes an honorable mention for myself as it is, while more hopeful and interesting plot twist in the Castlevania franchise. My greatest disappointment is that we never got to see the epic 1999 ensemble facing off against Dracula in the Demon Castle War, but rather just sequels occurring after the event and foretelling of it by a character in Curse of Darkness named Saint Germain. But sadly, we have what we do, and hopefully fan minds make some kind of interpretation of those events in the year 1999. Alright, so the next honorable mention in Castlevania's top 10 is Castlevania Lords of Shadow Mirror of Fate. So I'm just going to say Mirror of Fate here for short. While the original Lords of Shadow makes the top 10, the second game in the Lords of Shadow reboot, Mirror of Fate, does receive an honorable mention for it being a rather dark and tragic twist as part of this turning point in the Lords of Shadow story. Mirror of Fate was originally released for the Nintendo 3DS as a side-scrolling Metroidvania, in which the player gets to play as a reimagining of the original Castlevania protagonist, Simon Belmont. Ultimately, Gabriel Belmont in the original Lords of Shadow had conceived a son with Marie before he had killed her under demonic possession. His son would be known as Trevor Belmont and would see through visions of a family heirloom known as the Mirror of Fate that the powerful vampire Lord Dracula was actually Gabriel, his father, along with the fact that he would be doomed to die in battle with the Dark Lord himself. With this knowledge, Trevor ultimately heads out to battle his father Dracula, but not before telling his wife Sypha and his son Simon to flee home and take refuge elsewhere, wishing for them to be safe. Trevor never returns, but Simon returns a decade later with a whip to destroy Dracula where his father Trevor apparently failed. Over the course of the game, in addition to retrieving your father's vampire killer whip, you find out playing as Simon that your father Trevor had died fighting Dracula. As a player, you would find out through flashbacks that the mysterious vampire known as Alucard, who tries to help Simon against Dracula, is actually Simon's father Dracula, having been turned vampiric by his father after his father realized that the man he had killed was also his own son. You also do not find out about Trevor being Alucard from his own words, but you do find out from a flashback section of the game which ends with the final boss battle between Trevor and his father Gabriel, who is now Dracula. Even more saddening is the fact that Alucard doesn't tell in-game to Simon that he is his father, possibly to protect Simon or lessen the grief such a revelation would deliver to him. Nonetheless, Simon goes back to home to marry his fiancée Selena, who is a reference to the fiancée of Simon Belmont in the Castlevania arcade game known as The Haunted Castle. Now, my last honorable mention on this list is none other than the original, the OG, the 1986 Castlevania, which started it all. Now, while Castlevania with its 1986 release for the Famicom and NES is here, why does it get an honorable mention, you might ask? Here's why. For the manual! If you did not have the manual for the Japanese version of the game, you got the worst deal, as the game manual in Japanese also included the story for the original Castlevania and some artwork. If you wonder why people say, hey, Castlevania was the night before Easter, well, you'd find it out if you got it in the Japanese manual, the original manual for the game, and not the manual released elsewhere, which is shorter. In fact, the original Japanese game manual is 43 pages long, along with artwork and story for how the game began. You do not get this in the 23-page manual I have for the North American release. So yes, that's the big twist here. You got a better manual if you actually had the original manual, such as facts you wouldn't have known about the original Castlevania from other sources. But you can find it today in a website known as Castlevania Crypt, which has digital versions of the various Castlevania game manuals all across the series. So I recommend checking out Castlevania Crypt. Good resource for researching about Castlevania. Alright, now here we are at the number one. What is the number one plot twist in a Castlevania game? It may surprise you, it may not. So let's start with the little countdown here. Get ready and let the countdown begin. Now here it is, the number one. What could it be? What could it be? This such incredible, stunning plot twist you have in a Castlevania game? Well, wait no further. It is the one, the only Castlevania Curse of Darkness. Yes, that's the number one plot on the twist on this list. Castlevania Curse of Darkness was released on November 1st, 2005 as the second Castlevania game for the Sony PlayStation 2. I previously had a little celebration last year, November, when we hit the 20th anniversary of this game. It also had a release on the Microsoft Xbox shortly thereafter. What makes this game have such a crazy plot twist that it makes the number one on my list? Well, let's go and break it down. In and of itself, Castlevania Curse of Darkness strays heavily from a lot of the conventions that make Castlevania what it was in terms of the gameplay mechanics and layout of the world you are in. The lack of mechanical death traps in this game. You don't even fight bats as a regular monster. What's up with that? And I'm sorry, Dracula turning into a swarm of bats in order for him to transport from one spot to the next, that doesn't count. Yeah, you do fight Dracula in this game. But it shouldn't be a surprise that Dracula comes back to life, because you can't really kill him for good in this game series. Or can you? But, yeah, you don't have a lot of this. So the game becomes just about just fighting, collecting parts, and getting things. And I mean, yeah, sure, Castlevania has always been about fighting, but in most of these you have a vertical climb. In most of these you have to jump without falling on spikes, and these traps like falling on spikes or falling into gears or cogs and getting crushed in them, they're largely absent from this game, just not here. The voice acting in it, I like it, I really do. You have the main character, or Hector, he's voiced by Crispin Freeman, who does a lot of other cool animated voices such as Alucard Helsing, and of course you have Liam O'Brien, you think, as Isaac LaFerez. I'm saying Isaac LaFerez to distinguish him from the animated version. But yeah, these two voices, I mean, Isaac sounds like a good Joker voice. Well, actually, come to think of it, Liam O'Brien did voice the Joker, and he's also been in the game people are crazy about now called Dispatch as one of the villains in there, and other voices. So these voice actors, they were great. I mean, one of the things I'd say is, hey, play Curse of Darkness just to hear Crispin Freeman as a voice of Hector. You think, wow, that's an awesome Hector voice. But it's not that great of a Castlevania game when it comes to all these conventions and mechanics that you play with in Curse of Darkness. So it's lacking in some of the bestiary, and it's lacking in terms of the vertical climbing. However, here's the thing. The plot twist is great. It's the strongest part of this game overall. It's part of a time where you had games such as Bioshock, Knights of the Republic, and so on, where you had a big plot twist that you got revealed to your character. So let's take a look at the plot. The story of Curse of Darkness begins 4 years after Castlevania 3, Dracula's Curse. Dracula had adopted two young men, Hector, we don't know what his last name is, and Isaac Laferez, to serve as his highest-ranking officers in his army of monsters. Isaac and his sister Julia Laferez had run away after their parents had been hanged for witchcraft, with only Isaac choosing to enter Dracula's haunted castle. Hector had suffered abuse from his parents for his bizarre behavior and magical powers, but had run away in fear and remorse when, out of his rage, his animal companions had set the local church on fire with his parents and many others inside. Hector figured there's no going back when I've killed so many people, or rather caused the deaths of so many people. Hector was adopted by Dracula 2 years after Dracula had taken in Isaac. Dracula had also taught his adopted sons his own dark arts of devil forging, the art of summoning demonic entities to fight alongside them, or aid them in other tasks such as casting spells or handling various other tasks in the world, such as breaking barriers, unlocking chests, or giving them a flight through the air. In essence, the summoned demons or innocent devils within the game serve as Hector and Isaac equivalent of sub-weapons used by the Belmont characters, but there is something far more sinister and dark about the Devil Forge Masters. At the time of Castlevania 3 Dracula's Curse, Hector had deserted from Dracula's army before Trevor Belmont's party had raided Dracula's castle. And yes, if you go into the manga for Castlevania Curse of Darkness and hear from Trevor himself, it was canon in Castlevania, officially, under Iga anyways, that Trevor Belmont had all three companions. He had Sypha, Grant, and Alucard, all of them in his team. So that's revealed in this game. That's one plot twist. It isn't the big one, but it's a revelation. But on that time, when it was time to battle against the Belmonts and the forces of good, Hector deserted from Dracula's army before Trevor's party arrived at the castle. Isaac Laferez was left suffering defeat without his brother in arms. Hector, after his desertion from Dracula's army, found life in a village where he would be rescued by a nun named Rosalie, who would leave her service as a nun to become Hector's wife in time. This apparent happiness, however, would not last. When Dracula had died, he let out the Curse of Darkness. Similar to how a Curse of Darkness had occurred to cause Simon Belmont to grow ill and die in Simon's Quest, a version of the curse on a far greater scale had occurred when Dracula died in Castlevania 3. Humanity grew increasingly enraged and resentful toward one another, and like in Simon's Quest, there was a similar solution, which we'll get to later. Isaac Laferez had grown increasingly insane and masochistic and decided after he found Hector he would punish Hector with his own revenge by making sure Hector suffered a loss like he had suffered in his life, the defeat and loss of his adopted father, Dracula, and the loss of his real parents as they hung lifeless from the gallows. So he took out this revenge with a sinister plot, in wherein he poisoned apples on an apple tree, wherein Rosalie would pick the apples and put the poisoned apples in her apple pie. The plot worked, and multiple villagers died from eating the poisoned apples in her apple pie. Rosalie was blamed for murder and witchcraft for her pie being the source of poison to villagers. Isaac then returned to the unknown abandoned castle where he'd begin the game, knowing Hector would seek him out in retribution. As another note here, it was not Dracula's wife who was burned at the stake, actually. She was crucified. And here in this manga for Castlevania Symphony of the Night, you can see that there's bloody holes where they put nails through her hands and wrists. But it was not Lisa who was burned. It was actually Rosalie, or Hector's wife and former nun, who was burned at the stake in Iga canon. But here we are at the beginning of Castlevania Curse of Darkness. Now, what I've showed you here in this story is from hard-to-find manga from Konami in the Konami magazines. It's very difficult to find, but it is part of the official story in Castlevania Curse of Darkness or Symphony of the Night, and various other Castlevania games for which they've made manga for. So, something I hope is that they ever remaster these 3D Castlevania games, that the accompanying manga will be digitally included as part of the collection. It's really rare, and it tells you parts of the story that enhance the overall plot a little bit, in my opinion. Now, getting back to Curse of Darkness, you play the role of Hector, and throughout the game, you get followed by a mysterious priest calling himself Zed. It gets even more weird because you also get a man who's allegedly a time traveler called Saint Germain. He looks way different. Obviously, he has the top hat and red coat. And you have certain abilities that seem unique to you as a Devil Forge Master. Now, let's go through how these powers work. So, Hector and Isaac had their own natural gifts before they became Devil Forge Masters. Now, becoming a Devil Forge Master meant they were imbued with power from Dracula himself to summon actual demons from hell. And you do get Trevor Belmont, but the other members of his party do not show up, just Trevor. So, too bad. The trio is gone. It's kind of sad, but you gotta do what you gotta do. So, to get into how Devil Forge Masters were, they were gifted individuals in arts such as telepathically communicating with animals as Hector did, or in the case of Isaac Laferez, he was a master of alchemy, metallurgy. The power of devil forging was imbued in the game specifically by Dracula himself as part of his power of dominus or dominion over the forces of chaos. By giving them some of his dark powers, Dracula essentially made Hector and Isaac linked to him, like him, compatible with his essence in some dark way. The dark haunting revealed in Curse of Darkness was because that Hector and Isaac had been imbued with a portion of Dracula's own unholy powers. They became, should we say, the equivalent of Voldemort's Horcruxes. Yeah, I'm talking about the villain from Harry Potter known as Voldemort, who had Horcruxes where he could back up his soul into somebody if he died. But if you don't believe me, here, we'll go listen to the actual reveal from Zed himself, and we find out who exactly Zed is. So let's watch it for a minute.
Die, Isaac, die!
Do not let the curse take hold of you. I'm certain that she would not wish you to pay such a price for your revenge.
This murderous impulse, this thirst for bloody vengeance, this is not me. 'Tis the curse! Dracula's curse!
Oh, and you would not fall prey to the curse. Praiseworthy indeed. I wonder why. Was your desire for vengeance weak, or was your spirit strong? No matter. Either way, 'tis well finished. Your efforts have been a great boon to me. The moment you wavered was all I needed.
Zed. So, you're the one behind all of this.
You could say that.
You used me to revive Lord Dracula.
Even so. Devil Forge Masters alone are suffused in my master's magic. Thus only a Devil Forge Master can be the vessel for his reawakening. I knew you would be the best material. Yes, much more so than Isaac. That is why I guided you here, so that you may fully regain your powers.
Who are you?
However, for Lord Dracula to be reborn in you, the curse had to take hold of you. When you rejected the curse, you proved to be useless. Truly, 'tis most unfortunate.
That weapon! You are none other than death!
Soon my master will enter Isaac's body. Though you were favored, Isaac will do. Dracula will once more walk the night.
And as for you, it is time for you to die.
In essence, after this final confirmation by Zed, who is actually the Grim Reaper, or Death in disguise, you find out, okay, it all makes sense now. It all adds up. So basically, Saint Germain is warning you. Why? Because if you died, you would just become Dracula himself. In this case of this game, officially, it was Isaac who became Dracula because Isaac died sooner than Hector did. But that's it. That's the twisted reveal. If a Devil Forge Master dies, Dracula's soul will possess the body, and the Devil Forge Master's corpse, in all practical means, becomes Dracula himself. If it would happen, this is worse than Simon's Quest. This isn't just dying, this is you become Dracula and he can undo whatever you've done. And it would have been even worse if Isaac had killed Hector. Why? Because Dracula's back. He's still got Isaac as a pretty formidable ally to destroy it. Destroy them all. Destroy the Belmonts. And the other party members that Trevor Belmont had throughout Dracula's Curse, they're just not there. They can't help you here for whatever reasons. So in this case, you have something that's in a sense greater than Lords of Shadow. It's supposed to be a destiny that Hector would become Dracula and Dracula would come back. They preferred Hector, but unlike Gabriel, it's a destiny he could fight against the odds. And that goes back to the theme that's happened multiple times in Castlevania. Simon would fight to make sure that Dracula's curse would be lifted, and here so would Hector. But it's that thing where you go against the odds because you will not accept that fate. You will fight to ensure that fate does not materialize. And it's just that horrifying thing that you're dead and Dracula's walking around with your dead body as Dracula, that it's something you can't die. You can't lose. Because it's the worst kind of fate you could have in a Castlevania game. And it was kind of similar to the idea where they wanted to sacrifice Shinoa, and just like Barlow, Dracula's been your adopted father like Barlow was, but in this case, you're not just sacrificed, you become Dracula himself, and as Hector, he would have been dead for all purposes. This is what makes it the greatest plot twist in Castlevania. And in spite of it not being that great of a Castlevania game, the cinematics and the overall plot twist is the best part of it, and it's the top of the line for a Castlevania plot twist. All in all, this video is my presentation of the 10 greatest plot twists in the Castlevania game series. If you agree or disagree with this order or have other plot twists from the series available to mention, feel free to mention them in the comments section. I want to wish you and other Castlevania or horror fans out there an incredible year of 2026, or the 40th anniversary of the game series, beginning with the release of the original Castlevania on September 26, 1986. I look forward to having a wonderful year celebrating the 40th anniversary of the game's release, and hope that the fandom and Konami will also enjoy celebrating this epic anniversary year as well. If you enjoyed the video, click a like and feel free to support the channel and future video productions by subscribing to the channel and clicking the bell for notifications of upcoming productions. Let's celebrate the 40th anniversary together and hope for a 3D collection. I will conclude this episode of Castlevania Lore by saying in conclusion, until we meet again, farewell.